This extremely unusual and unfortunate story happened in Moscow in 1984, and it started off just as unusually and badly. That day, police officers were chasing a criminal named Bogulchak through Luzhny Ostrov Park. The officers were exhausted, and it seemed like they wouldn't catch him. Suddenly, Bogulchak came out to meet them. He was holding a child in his arms, and there were blood stains on his jacket. He didn't get a chance to say a word before one of the officers, in a fit of rage, pulled out his gun. A shot was fired. The criminal collapsed heavily to the ground, trying his best not to drop the child. Bogulchak died on the spot, and the officers picked up the child. It turned out to be a boy about 5 years old. He was unconscious. Only then did the officers notice that the boy was injured, but the wounds weren't fresh. An ambulance and an investigative team arrived. The boy was taken to the hospital, and the experts examined the area and confirmed what was already clear: Bogulchak hadn't attacked the child. He had found him in the forest, couldn't leave him to fend for himself, picked him up, and headed towards the officers for help. Instead of his freedom, he chose to save the child. In the heat of the chase, the officers misunderstood and opened fire. While doctors desperately fought for the boy's life, law enforcement tried to figure out what had happened and how the little boy ended up in the forest alone and injured. He wasn't injured by accident, but deliberately, with blows from something heavy. Soon they found what it was: a hammer with a broken handle was discovered nearby. Who could have done such a thing? The nearest houses were a short distance away from the scene. The officers began canvassing these residential areas, trying to identify the boy and find out if his parents were looking for him. However, the local residents knew nothing, and no one had reported a missing child to the police. The officers decided to expand their search within the park itself, hoping to find some traces of the boy or the perpetrator. As the weather warmed up, the snow was melting, and the attempt seemed hopeless, but luck was on their side. Soon they found something that could help in the investigation: the broken handle of the hammer. The same one they had found earlier. There were no fingerprints on it, but it had an inventory number burned into it. Now they had to do painstaking work to find the company that owned that hammer, a lead that would take time to follow up on. A few days passed while the investigation into the boy's case continued. Then, the Babushkinsky District Police received a call about an attack on an apartment. When the officers arrived, they found a gruesome scene: the bodies of 3 people that had clearly been there for days. Identifying them wasn't difficult: Natalia Kiriva, her husband Vladimir, and their elderly relative, WWII veteran Arkady Kiriv. The call to the police had been made by Vladimir's mother, Alla Kiriva. She had returned from a suburban resort and discovered the crime. The forensic experts concluded that the criminals had used a knife and a hammer. But what was the motive? The apartment was in disarray, suggesting a robbery, but killing an entire family for a few pieces of jewelry and a small amount of cash. It didn't add up. While searching the apartment, one of the detectives noticed a photograph of a child. He picked it up and froze. It was the same boy they had found in the park. Now they knew his name: Kolya Kiriv. It also made sense why no one had reported him missing. Most of his family was dead, and his grandmother was away. There was no doubt that these cases were connected, as the perpetrator or perpetrators were clearly the same. The experts established the time of the Kirivs' deaths, which brought a new mystery. It appeared that they had attacked Arkady Kiriv first, and only hours later Natalia and Vladimir. How could that have happened? The detectives were baffled. And how did little Kolya end up in the park? The only one who could answer that was Kolya himself, who had just regained consciousness in the hospital. The law enforcement officers rushed to him, but they were disappointed. Kolya didn't remember that day at all, and there was a high chance that his brain had suffered damage, potentially leaving him disabled. Unfortunately, a miracle didn't happen, and the detectives would have to uncover the truth on their own. They questioned Alla Kiriva, Kolya's grandmother, who had called the police. She insisted that the family had no enemies and no significant valuables. In her opinion, the only possible motive was that the crime was committed by someone mentally unstable. The detectives noticed that Alla was nervous and fidgety. On one hand, she had lost her family, so her emotions were understandable. On the other hand, they checked her alibi just in case it was confirmed. Allah was indeed at the resort. Meanwhile, they finally identified the company that the hammer with the broken handle belonged to. It turned out to be one of the training and production centers UPC. They recognized the hammer, which had disappeared some time ago. It was unlikely that an outsider had stolen it, and it was also unlikely to be a student, so they decided to investigate the teachers. Law enforcement's attention was drawn to a man named Anton Vodopyanov. According to his colleagues, he had become nervous and fearful recently, and had even told a friend, over a bottle of vodka, that he deserved to be executed. Quite an unexpected confession for a law-abiding citizen. They decided to interview Vodopyanov's neighbors, and that's when things got interesting. As the detective was leaving the building where Vodopyanov lived, he suddenly ran into Alla Kiriva. She turned pale, mumbled something about being late, and quickly walked away. Kiriva lived at a completely different address. So, there was the connection. They then talked to Alla Kiriva's colleagues at her workplace and learned something interesting. Alla had changed recently. She started paying a lot of attention to her appearance and clothes. It seemed like she had a new admirer. Could it be Anton Vodopyanov? Alla was 52 years old, and Anton was about 10 years younger. It was possible. The detectives decided they needed to arrest Vodopyanov. However, he wasn't at home, nor was he at work. Had Kiriva warned him, and he disappeared? Alla Kiriva herself was also missing from home. Law enforcement suspected the pair had sensed the investigation closing in and decided to flee. But things turned out to be more mundane. Soon, patrol officers detained Vodopyanov in Lozny Ostrov Park. They noticed him trying to push something wrapped in a rug into the water. Inside the rug was Alla Kiriva's body. And Vodopyanov immediately confessed to everything during the interrogation, revealing a story that shocked even the seasoned officers. Alla Kiriva wasn't thrilled when her son Vladimir brought his new wife Natalia, who already had a son named Kolya, into their two-bedroom apartment. Everyone lived together like cats and dogs. Little Kolya suffered the most. He wasn't wanted by his mother. His stepfather never accepted him, and his step-grandmother couldn't stand him. Especially when he called her grandma. Alla didn't want to age. She tried everything to stay young. And now this kid was calling her grandma. Then Alla met Anton Vodopyanov, and a whirlwind romance began. Alla couldn't believe her luck. They wanted to live together, but where? There was no space in Alla's apartment, and Anton lived with his relatives. Gradually, a sinister idea began to form in Alla's mind. She needed to free the apartment from these people who weren't hers. Didn't she deserve to live happily with the man she loved, instead of with her son's wife and an annoying little boy? If she got rid of Kolya, maybe Vladimir would leave Natalia too. In any case, she could find a way to get rid of Natalia later. And so one day it was time to act. She chose a moment when Natalia and Vladimir weren't home and took Kolya for a walk in the park. The boy was happy that his always grumpy grandma was finally spending time with him. He ran around joyfully, not noticing anything around him. He didn't even notice when Grandma took a hammer out of her bag. After doing her dirty deed, she didn't expect the old handle to break and the hammer to fly into the snow. It was too risky to search for it near the boy, so she hurried away, throwing the handle away along the way. That was another mistake. The detectives found both the hammer and the handle. And we have to note her cunning. She took the hammer from Anton's apartment with a purpose to involve her lover in the crime and bind them together forever. Running home, Alla Kiriva started quickly packing to go to the sanatorium and secure her alibi. But her elderly father-in-law, Arkady, noticed the blood on her clothes and demanded an explanation. Alla panicked and grabbed another hammer. The harmless woman turned into a raging fury in one day. After that, she called Anton and told him everything. He rushed over, and together they started turning the apartment upside down, staging a robbery. But then, the key turned in the lock. Natalia and Vladimir had come home. Now Vodopyanov panicked and grabbed a knife. The crazed couple left the apartment, with Alla heading to the resort, while Anton was left alone with his guilty conscience. A few days later, Alla returned and called the police, only then learning that Kolya had survived. She was a nervous wreck, afraid he would tell everything. But the boy remembered nothing. Still, the detectives figured it all out when they saw Alla at Vodopyanov's building. Then Alla ran to Anton in a panic, realizing they were about to be arrested. Anton couldn't think of anything better than to kill Alla, but he didn't have time to dispose of her body. That's love for you. Anton Vodopyanov was sentenced to the highest punishment, and Kolya Kiriyev soon started to recover and, to the doctor's surprise, fully healed within a year. Maybe that's some form of justice in life?